of coming to university is about being disciplined. You know, you are literally taught a discipline. You're taught a way of thinking, a way of knowing, a way of engaging that is specific to a discipline. And I think that's quite wonderful, actually. I think you need to know what that process is of becoming a disciplinary subject in order to then think, yes, but what are the limitations of that? What can I borrow? What can I bring? What can I change?
I started to do my master's degree here. I went to do my doctorate in France. So I did my master's degree here. I think there was a sense that what we were engaged in was an amateur activity in the strong sense of the French. So you did it as amateur, you did it for the love of it. So there's where your passion thing comes in. And because it was done that way, it wasn't subject to certain constraints. And so, you know, you weren't entitled to say to your supervisor, listen, I gave you that draft 2 weeks ago and you haven't said anything about it since, you know, because your supervisor was an amateur as well. And she or he, that's a bit of a joke because there weren't very many she's around, but anyhow, supervisors were doing that work because they were interested in it, you know, and you were writing a thesis because you were interested and you had to have a shared interest with them. That's all fine. There's nothing about that I consider reprehensible or in any way weird. It's actually a great tradition in the humanities. That's why people mostly did most of the work they did. But I think that we have seen the professionalisation of the humanities as well. And I know I've got colleagues who deplore that, but I don't. I think what professionalisation achieves is minimum standards. It achieves reliability, it achieves accountability, so the students turn up, they know what to expect.
If we go back to the 17th century, then it's the case that engaging in activities such as trade or international trade or being a merchant was viewed dubiously, and it was viewed dubiously in Western Europe because this was an intensely Christian society that used theological arguments and concepts as the primary lens through which to understand phenomena arising from everyday life, such as trading and being a merchant. And of course there's the biblical injunction against usury, lending money for interest. So in that situation, merchants and traders and those sympathetic to that interest had to work very hard to legitimise what they were doing, and they tended to do it by drawing on Christian concepts, which strategically is a very sensible thing to do. So for example, the idea that being a merchant could be a vocation, something to which one was called by God, or the idea that by trading for profit, one enriched one's nation and pursued one's self-interest at the same time, which invokes the idea of a benevolent, providential ordering of the world such that people naturally serve a common purpose at the same time as they serve their own purpose. So you see these types of concepts being used to legitimise what had been a questionable form of activity. If we then fast forward into the 20th century and into our own time, then it seems to be the case that the idea that we are individuals possessed of interests, a primary interest of which is to acquire wealth, then that idea has absolutely multiplied and gone in all sorts of interesting directions. One that concerns all of us at university is the idea of human capital. So the idea is that when I study a degree, when I do an undergraduate course, what I'm doing is not becoming educated or a better person or learning more about the history of my world or how I can contribute to my society, but I'm investing in my own human capital. So I forego getting a wage now, but I acquire capital instead, and then that capital will bear a rate of return for the rest of my life. So that idea, popularised by economists, especially economists coming from the so-called Chicago School, is essentially the foundation for the system of higher education funding that we have in this country. The idea is that when you get a degree, chances are you will earn more than somebody who just leaves high school and doesn't invest in the human capital represented in a degree. For that reason, therefore, you should pay at least some of the costs of your education because you'll get a benefit. And so, as everybody knows, once you earn more than a certain amount, you start to pay back the debt that the government agreed to allow you so that you could undertake your education. So in that sense, we've come a long way.
Becoming a fast learner. The next one, I think, is being able to synthesize large volumes of information into something that's really easy to read, and also being able to critically analyse issues, social issues, political issues. So I'd say they're the top 3 things that I got out of my degree. In terms of, critical thinking, that was probably the thing that I noticed most quickly when I went into the workforce. Critical thinking is really the ability to look at a problem from multiple perspectives and work out the root cause of that issue or challenge and develop, and as a result of an analysis of that particular issue that's quite comprehensive and never just involves one person, it usually involves consultation. Being able to do that process, that's critical thinking to me. And then actually coming up with, I wouldn't say solutions, but potential interventions or potential ideas that could help address that challenge. So critical thinking is actually, obviously quite complex. And for me, it's really not just about thinking about ideas or thinking about a challenge, but actually coming up with solutions that can be implemented in practice. Yeah, I mean, I've had a fairly diverse career, I think. I've worked in many countries on many education issues, essentially. So once I left university, I realised that education was my passion, mainly because I started working for the Department of Education. And then I just started moving to different countries and working in different non-profits, government, businesses that focused on education. So part of that ended up meaning that I spent 4 years in Africa, in Ghana and Uganda, working on quite different projects in the 2 different countries. But in Uganda, I managed a team of 12 staff who were essentially teachers in high schools across the country, and they taught entrepreneurship and leadership to high school students, because Uganda is a country where essentially the majority of people who live there are under the age of 15, and so that just means that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the employment market when they all leave high school, and so our idea was that more people could get into entrepreneurship, let's say, and identifying community problems and seeking to solve them. So that was the aim, that's what I was essentially doing in Uganda. And again, I was reflecting on how the BA helped me in that particular context. I had been in the workforce for quite a while, maybe 8 years when I got that job. But what I found really helped me was, way back when I did my BA, I learnt about how to gather lots of information, synthesize that information, and then, write fairly concisely about what I'd learnt. And that was really helpful in Uganda, because I needed to convince leaders of my organisation that I needed to do what I needed to do in the program. So make changes, for example, implement training for my staff, different things like that. And so being able to combine reading and understanding the context with discussions with people across Kampala really helped me to create these, reports that essentially convinced leaders of what I needed to do.
I definitely think I think this goes across all university courses. It makes you responsible for your own time, and it makes you responsible for having, 10 different things on the go and trying to line that all up. I actually found work much easier than study, because you have a external kind of deadline, like your boss, much more frequently than, say, a thesis that is due 8 months away, whereas you've got deliverables to your boss the next day. I think the things I learnt from my degree, I think from IR, was definitely about trying to read a situation, get as much kind of context as possible before trying to problem solve something. And then I think from my Spanish degree, I definitely learnt about different ways to approach a situation rather than just the dominant the dominant approach.
It certainly, I think, means when I visit an art museum, I certainly enjoy the experience a lot more. But also, you know, aspects of even public speaking and those sorts of ways of building self-confidence that can play out in your social life and the way that you, you know, interact publicly and things like that. Yeah. I suppose it just, I feel like I've gained even more interest in aspects of culture beyond the visual arts as well, into you know, my interest in sort of food culture and other aspects of my life as well.